When you start as a solopreneur, one option to get going is to borrow the money you need. But should you ever do this? My name's Gareth. I've been a solopreneur now for 25 years. I've started several businesses and I've borrowed six-figure sums to get at least one of them off the ground. So I'm with you when you're worrying and considering your options when it comes to financing your big move. The predictable and safe answer to the question, of course, would inevitably be to say no, don't borrow. And normally, well, that might be the right thing. But sometimes that means that opportunities can get missed. And it's just not the right way to approach this. You are a business and businesses sometimes use finance. So I'm going to take you through my own process and it will enable you to get this huge decision done without so much fear. And yes, there are times when you can borrow money to get started, but I'll give you the circumstances when that works a bit later on. Okay, let's get to the nub of this. What we're really talking about here is the downside, and that's the risk that you borrow money for your possible new business life and you end up not being able to pay it back, with all the implications that that has for you and those around you. What we need to do is to decide how real that risk is and what we can do to 1, identify it, 2, reduce, or even 3, just accept it. So let's start with identify. Here, the dreams you have for the future have to go on the back burner for a while because it's time to get real. We need to identify the hard numbers behind the dreams at the beginning of your solopreneur life. How much money do you actually need? This means doing a cash flow forecast, and I've created one that you can use if you like. It's in the link down here. If you don't want my version, it'll at least show you how to build your own, but you can have a copy of mine for free if you like. I know if you hate numbers, this will be hard, but it's just unavoidable, okay? Next, we come to your assumptions. Now in your head, as you think about the business idea you've got, you will have made a load of these assumptions, and that's okay, because there's no alternative when looking into the future. But how certain are you of the realism of your assumptions you have made when you predicted your financing needs? Let's write them down. How certain are you of your first year's sales? What are the unavoidable costs you're going to have? What money do you need to live on each month? Don't forget, we're talking about the uncertainty you have here, nothing else. If you already have, say, a cast iron commitment from 3 of your first 3 customers, and you know that will bring you in your first year's money, great, you score high in terms of the certainty of your assumptions. Costs, especially your unavoidable costs you will incur, like having expenses, rent, etc., they should score high too, because they're easier to foresee and to get real-world information on the numbers. Do the research, reduce the risk. So now we have a firm grasp of what the numbers should look like for the time of your launch. Plus we have a good estimate of how likely you are to actually hit the numbers in the forecast. Our cash flow forecast will tell us now how much money we're likely to need. But what we haven't done yet is to look at what the borrowing itself will do for our costs. How much you're going to have to pay to get hold of the money. And you've got to add that into your cash flow forecast under the costs line as well. Now I'm not going to look at this stage at all of the various sources for finance and the interest rates, but beware, if you're thinking of financing via something like credit cards or a fixed term loan, you need to take the monthly payment into account, not just the interest rate. Don't forget, we're talking cash flow here. Next is to look at any ways we haven't considered to reduce the risk. Really, there are 3 ways to do this. You've done the first, and that's to be clear on what the forecast numbers look like. The second is to understand that no matter how much time you spend on the cash flow forecast, it will be wrong. I'm sorry, it just will. It's just a matter of by how much. This is the real world. What you need to understand is what the projections look like if you're slightly wrong. Now I've done this in my forecast where I've flexed the numbers for a pessimistic outcome, but you should do the same. And the last thing you need to do is to revisit your assumptions and look at where you can cut down on the business outgoings without putting the whole business at risk. Yes, this might mean cutting back on your outgoings, but that can't last forever, don't forget. Look at the business costs and see what you can do there. Next, take your time and see whether you can reduce the level of uncertainty. You can't say for certain what your sales might be, but you can look at the other end of the equation much more easily. Talk to finance sources and in principle see what terms they will give you and what information they will need. You'll find you'll probably have to create a cash flow forecast anyway, and you'll be one step ahead of the game at this point. Then work out what the monthly payments might be like, and don't forget to add it back into the cash flow. The next element to look at is other funding sources. Do you have any sources that might give you better terms than just purely commercial? And here I'm talking things like friends, relatives, all that sort of thing. Now they might help, but I do know how uncomfortable that can be talking to them. And if you're sensitive and diplomatic, you may get some joy here, but it really boils down to the fact that if things do go wrong, who would you rather owe? Now, I'm not being funny here. Many people would rather die than owe a family member, and that's understandable. And it is a risk for your relationship with them too. But think about it, at least. I've borrowed money from friends and family in the past. What I did was I made sure of a few things from the start. Firstly, I wrote down the terms of the loan and I gave them a proper hard copy of it. In it, I put exactly what my obligations were for the repayment and interest and all that sort of thing. But additionally, I made them feel like they had a stake in the success of the business by keeping them in the loop on a regular basis as to how things were going. I was very grateful that I did that when things got very tight at one stage. A particular family member actually offered me the option of delaying a payment to get past a temporary issue simply because he knew what the business was up to. Okay, next risk is to look at what you can do in terms of the structure of your business. If you're forming a business, you're not automatically liable for the debts of that business just because you're a director of a limited company. Now, banks, of course, are very aware of this, and what they will do at almost any cost is to avoid taking on a risk that you have by them lending you money. The way they do this, of course, is to insist that if things do go wrong, they can sell some of your assets to get their money back. Most times they'll go behind the law and insist on a personal guarantee that underpins their borrowing. So this is an area though that I strongly recommend you consult a legal professional before assuming anything at all, and make sure you understand all of the terms of any loans that you're thinking of taking out with third parties. So all of the work we've done so far, trying to bring as much certainty as we can into an uncertain future, has to stop at some point. And spoiler alert, you still won't definitively know that you're safe to borrow the money. You'll have a level of risk, and you will just have to accept that level of risk. If you don't like the feeling of accepting that level of risk, it's perfectly okay to stop right here and see what your options are without borrowing. If you do feel that that's acceptable to you, this is the reality in business as a solopreneur. It can feel riskier than being an employee of a big organisation, especially in the early days. But don't forget, sometimes the big business risks can blow you off course just as effectively. So, back to the big question I asked at the beginning. Is it ever the right thing to do to borrow money to start a life as a solopreneur? Well, I did, a lot of it. It was a huge strain for me and my family. Things got incredibly tight at some points and it could have ended in disaster, but it didn't. And that's because I've been as careful as I possibly could be at the beginning to check all my assumptions, cut back on spending, and really manage things. Can you do that? Only you know, and only you can say whether you should borrow money to start a business. It will be your decision. Good luck. Let me know how it goes.